can't combat these crimes without you and your help. And that's, working in this field for, as long as I have, and even those that came before me, we know that it's truly a team effort, and it does not matter, what you do professionally, or where you live, or what part of the state you're in. We all have a role to play in this. So I truly appreciate you taking the time and giving your attention to this topic today. So with that, you already heard a little bit about me, so I'm going to kind of go ahead and dive in. So the CEASE program is one of 5 programs that's offered by my organization, which is called the Arizona Anti-Trafficking Network. So I'm only one piece of the puzzle. So the CEASE program is really geared towards working with municipalities on ending sexual exploitation through a variety of different means, one of them being training. And I do understand that, CEASE stands for Cities Empowered Against Sexual Exploitation, but we really recognize that, though that name says city, that includes all municipalities. That also includes you guys at the county level. And our goal really is to bring counties into the fold on this as well. And you guys are kind of ahead of the curve because you're really the first to engage on this level with this program. So we're very excited and very appreciative that you guys are taking that step, because it's hard to be the first. And those who are the first, it's really something that we appreciate. Our other program is CSI. It's an after-school program for at-risk and trafficked youth. So really trying to give them a safe place to go after school so that they cannot be targeted. We have Just Men Arizona, which is we have a director who runs volunteer cyber patrols of mostly men volunteers who will actually interact with buyers who are looking to purchase sex through fake or decoy advertisements. And these men have conversations with them or online via chat about why they shouldn't buy sex, how so many people in prostitution are actually sex trafficking victims, and why they should stop that behavior. So it's a really cool intervention point. We also have the Safe Action Project, which you may have heard a little bit about. We have quite a few hotels and tourism related businesses up in your area that are actually SAFE certified, which means they as a business, as a hotel, motel, or other business, have trained at least 75% of their staff and do so on an annual basis. And then finally, we have trust, which, everything that is not encompassed by the rest of our organization kind of falls under trust. So we provide a lot of support to law enforcement, as well as to victim service providers, and sometimes victims directly through resources like laptops, things like that. We had a victim recently who was going back to school. She was out of the life, but she didn't have money for a laptop. So we provide that laptop for her so she can move on in her recovery journey. So the mission of CEASE is to eradicate sex trafficking in Arizona by focusing on the demand for paid sex. And we do this through prevention, education, and through some other technology-based solutions where we want to disrupt transactions that occur online for commercial sex. The other part of CEASE, though, is obviously that municipality piece. We know that, local government, that's where it's at. That's where we can make, a lot of that change happen. So we engage city governments statewide, and we know that if people are correctly informed about what this crime looks like and they have the right policies in place, that is one of the best things that we can do to effectively combat this crime. And of course, we all have a vested interest. We want people to come to our area. We want tourism flooding to our counties and our cities. And we also obviously live there, right? So we want our communities to be safe. And so that's one of the ways that we do that. And then, as I mentioned, we also target sex buyers. When it comes to different types of violence, there's a lot of different strategies you can employ, but we know that some of the most effective are those going to be targeted towards those who perpetrate that violence, which includes people who buy sex. So what is trafficking? Human trafficking is an exploitation-based crime in which traffickers are going to utilize force, fraud, or coercion to control victims. And there are going to be 2 types of trafficking: sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So when you hear that term human trafficking, that is not all that specific. Sex and labor trafficking both have very different dynamics, very different victim profiles, very different perpetrator profiles. So just have that understanding that human trafficking is the umbrella term. So as I mentioned, labor trafficking is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to recruit, harbor, transfer, or obtain a person or employ them for labor or services. Boiling that down, it's an exploitive labor situation, it's unpaid labor, it's underpaid labor, and it's working and being made to work in unsafe working conditions, or being promised a labor situation or a job that doesn't turn out to be what was intended. Now, the other side of this is sex trafficking. Okay, so the definition of sex trafficking is a little bit more complex, so just bear with me. Sex trafficking is when a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person performing the act is under 18. So a commercial sex act is any sex act at all that's done in exchange for something of value. So that could be sex in exchange for money. That could be a sex act done in exchange for a sandwich, a safe place to stay, clean clothes, drugs, whatever it happens to be. Okay, so as long as something of value is exchanged and there's a sex act occurring, that's commercial sex. Now, when you have that commercial sex act induced by force, fraud, or coercion, that's when you have a sex trafficking crime. However, if you have a minor, anyone under 18, who ever engages in commercial sex, we do not have to have evidence of force, fraud, or coercion for that person to be considered a victim. If you have a minor who performs a sex act in exchange for something of value, regardless of the circumstances, they are automatically considered to be a victim of sex trafficking, full stop. And I should say, I didn't say this at the top, but if there are any questions, one of the great things about, doing a training this way is that you guys can kind of feedback with me. So please feel free to put questions in the chat. I can't see the chat. So if somebody could let me know that those questions are coming through, I'm more than happy to take questions, just so you're aware. So those definitions that I shared with you, those are excerpts from the federal law, which is called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. That law provides the framework for all the other state statutes that exist that define sex trafficking crimes. And those three terms, force, fraud, and coercion, are key to understanding what needs to be evident for this to be considered a sex trafficking crime if that person is an adult. So force could be anything from physical to sexual violence, forced substance abuse, confinement, kidnapping, and then finally we have seasoning. So seasoning is a very concentrated amount of abuse that occurs within a short amount of time. And the purpose of that is to basically ensure that somebody is going to remain compliant. Okay, so this is probably maybe the more stereotypical scenario that you might hear about, where somebody is truly kidnapped or taken away from their area or their home and brought into a sex trafficking scenario. So I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to put a pin in that, and I want you to think about this fraud column, because in actuality, most of the time, when somebody is first recruited into sex trafficking, it's not by kidnapping or, the white van driving through the neighborhood. It's most of the time, it's fraud and deception. So most trafficking scenarios begin as the exploitation of an existing romantic, platonic, or familial relationship. Okay, so traffickers utilize deception, false promises, and grooming practices to get that victim to first trust them and to build a bond with them. Once they've been able to do that, they then begin to exploit that individual. So if you kind of think about just psychologically, it's a lot easier for that trafficker to make this individual fall in love with them, make them trust them, have this relationship already in place, and then slowly over time, try to get that victim involved in sex trafficking crimes. So I don't want anyone thinking that, oh, like sex trafficking is not violent, prostitution itself is not violent. It absolutely is. That is not what I'm saying. But just understand, like when you hear news stories or even watch movies or television shows about trafficking, they're mostly showing people getting kidnapped from malls and things like that. And that's not what this looks like. Most of the time, they're defrauded into it at first, like 9 times out of 10, that victim and their potential trafficker are in a romantic relationship. That's what the majority of this typically begins as. And then over time, they're going to obviously change their tune. But also just keep in mind that traffickers are brutal, sex buyers are brutal, and people in prostitution and sex trafficking situations are frequently subjected to all different types of abuse. So the final piece of this is we have coercion. So we've got threats, manipulation. So if you don't engage in commercial sex, then I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to hurt your family, anyone that you care about. They often will hold on to documents. So if you're interacting with somebody and they don't have access to their own identification, how often do you meet somebody who, they just can't, they don't have access to their own identification and there's no real pertinent reason why. That is a red flag to me. We also have victims who don't have access to their own money or cell phone. They can tell you all day long, well, I make $1,000 a day, but where is that money actually? Is there another person that's holding it for them? We have blackmail and sextortion. So frequently you'll have folks who, if that trafficker can get that victim to engage in one commercial sex act, they will often take pictures and videos of that and then use that as leverage. They say, if you don't continue working for me, I'm going to put this picture or video on the internet. I'm going to send it to everybody you care about. Everybody's going to see who you really are. And just kind of putting it in the 5,000 foot view. Every time somebody sees a picture or a video like that of somebody without their consent, that's an assault. Okay, that's the impact that it truly has on a victim. So some people might think, well, it's just a picture. They could still leave. No, that is, in their frame of mind, that's a complete violation. That is an assault every time that it occurs. So if that trafficker is threatening to put it on the internet for millions of people to see, millions of eyeballs to see that when they shouldn't, that's kind of what that victim is grappling with. They also have frequently will get victims pregnant so that they can have a child with that person. For those of us who are parents, of course, that if you have a child with somebody, for good, for bad, for worse, you're tied to that person for at least 18 years. So traffickers love to use kids as leverage. If you don't continue working for me, if you don't do, what I'm telling you to do, you don't see your kids that day, or I'm going to try to get full custody of our child. Finally, drugs and alcohol is another one. So traffickers are always going to look for folks who are vulnerable. And some of the most vulnerable people in our society are those with an alcohol or drug dependence. So a trafficker can then find somebody with an addiction and say, hey, I see that you have this addiction. If you want a steady supply of drugs and alcohol, I'll be that supplier, but you need to engage in commercial sex for me. Okay. And then finally, quotas. So a quota is a dollar amount that a trafficked person is required to earn before their trafficker is going to allow them privileges. Privileges like sleeping, eating, using the bathroom, seeing their children that day. That's truly what this looks like. Okay, so that person might have to work, all day, all night into the wee hours of the morning just to meet their quota, just so that they can lay their head on the pillow that night. Oftentimes with this crime, just like in, intimate partner violence and domestic violence, as some people refer to it, you have people will say, well, if they're not physically tied down, if they're not locked in a room or in a hotel or in an apartment, why don't they just leave? Well, it's for all of these reasons that I just shared with you. you frequently are going to have people who are either in love with the person who's exploiting them, or that person is their only family, or it's their only, even though this person is not safe, it's the safest person in their life. It very well could be. They've also had their life threatened. They've had the lives of their family members threatened and the people that they care about. I don't know about you, but if somebody's telling me that I have to do X, Y, and Z, otherwise my family will be harmed, I'm probably going to continue doing X, Y, and Z until I can figure out another way out. Okay. They've also, of course, most of the people in sex trafficking scenarios and in prostitution by and large come from very marginalized backgrounds. They have a host of issues that made them a little bit more vulnerable and more highly targeted by these traffickers in the first place. And so that's why you have kind of this trifecta of reasons why once that person is in a sex trafficking scenario, it's incredibly difficult for them to get out of it. So sex trafficking occurs in a ton of different venues. So the big three are going to be hotels and motels, illicit massage, and residential brothels. So apartments and houses, just regular looking apartments and houses. Again, we know a lot of this occurs actually in the hotel industry. About 79% of victims report having a contact with a hotel or a motel at some point throughout the course of their victimization. So that means they were either A, trafficked out of that hotel, or B, they were seeking shelter in that hotel on a temporary basis. Every city, for the most part, has issues with illicit massage businesses. That's a statewide issue. And then as far as residential brothels go, any apartment, duplex, house that can be a potential arena for prostitution and sex trafficking. Social media and online advertisements, this is really where a bulk of the interaction occurs before the actual commercial sex. So a lot of people will say, well, my city doesn't have street prostitution, in the way that many people would probably think, or a dedicated area of street prostitution. And I know up in Coconino County, I can't think of one area where you actually do have outdoor street prostitution. And that's the reason why that is because of the advent of the internet. So it used to be where every city would be able to know, or every county would be able to know, oh, this is the area where that outdoor prostitution is occurring. Okay. That's not the case anymore. All negotiation for the most part is occurring online via social media. So when it comes to traffickers recruiting, that's one big arena as well, but also all these advertisements are happening online. So traffickers and people in prostitution, sex trafficking victims, they will negotiate with that sex buyer, and they will meet at an indoor location. So they're going to meet in a hotel room. They're going to meet in a house. They're going to meet in an illicit massage business. So that's why us as members of the public, we're not likely going to see it in that vein, right? So just so you're aware, that we have this issue where people think that, oh, well, sex trafficking and prostitution, that's not in my community. It 100% is. And if you're not seeing it, that's just because it's all indoor.
We got a question in the chat real quick. And the question is all prostitution illegal in Arizona?
Can you repeat that? I didn't quite hear the end.
Yeah. Is all prostitution illegal in Arizona?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So we have trading for drugs and trading for food. So this is what we call survival sex. So when you have children who are sex trafficking victims, oftentimes they're run away from home. They've run away from foster care or DCS custody, and they are on the street. Somebody is offering them either A, drugs, or B, food, or a safe place to stay even. And that's in that scenario, you don't even have to have a third party trafficker. You have sex buyer A who's soliciting that child, which you could really call them a predator. And they're offering them basic needs. So that's a scenario where you only have two parties involved. You also have escort services. So to the question about is prostitution illegal in all of Arizona? The answer is yes. In terms of escorting, you technically have to have a license to be an escort. To my knowledge, we don't have anyone who's actually received an escort license in our state to date. There might have been one or two, but that's it. So escort services, it's a very fine line between lawful and prostitution, sex trafficking activities. So just kind of keep that in mind. Same thing goes with strip clubs too. And then finally, we have truck stops. So we absolutely have truck stop prostitution. While travel is not a requirement for being sex trafficked, the opportunity that's available for sex trafficking to occur at a truck stop is pretty ample, just because you have such a transient population. You have, a place for it to occur inside of that vehicle. And so there's kind of a lot of opportunity. I guess it's a crime of opportunity when it comes to truck stops. But there's a lot of work also being done by an organization called Truckers Against Trafficking to actually specifically combat truck stop prostitution. So human trafficking versus human smuggling, these two terms are often conflated and used interchangeably when they should not be. Trafficking and smuggling are two different crimes. Trafficking is an exploitation-based crime against an individual person. It involves those elements of force, fraud, or coercion, or the sexual exploitation of a minor. There's no international travel requirement, and the people who are trafficked are always considered to be victims because it is not voluntary. On the other side, smuggling is a crime against the border. The victim in that instance is actually that border. It's a transportation-based crime. It involves moving that person from one side of the border to the other. And at least at the outset, people who are smuggled are technically initially complicit in that. They've likely paid somebody a fee to bring them across that border. So they're not necessarily victims. But do keep in mind, as you'll see when we talk about a little bit more about who trafficking victims are, folks who are smuggled are very vulnerable. So that, let's just say they, arrive in Arizona today. They don't likely have a lot of economic resources. They may not speak the language. And not only that, but the person who brought them can turn around and say, okay, you work for me now in either an exploitative labor or a commercial sex scenario. So that person, can't refuse, because if they do, the person who brought them can threaten to harm them or hurt their family back home. They can't go to law enforcement because they also themselves just committed a crime. Okay. And, they don't have a lot of leverage or options. So if that person who smuggled them into the US decides to turn on them and to start trafficking them or labor trafficking them, then they really don't have any recourse. So just understand that smuggling, somebody who is smuggled can very easily end up becoming a trafficking victim. So recruitment tactics, as I mentioned, recruitment can occur in person, online, and a lot of this is done via social media. Traffickers are inherently lazy people, right? They're trying to make their living by exploiting other people. And so they're not necessarily always going into public places looking to find vulnerable people. They definitely do sometimes, but social media is the true hunting ground. A trafficker can sit on his couch, write a paragraph, and send it via direct message to 1,000 kids or 1,000 people that they find online and call it a day and just see who responds. Okay. It's incredibly easy for them. It's very low barrier and it's much more low risk than going out in person trying to recruit. But just keep in mind that we do still see in-person recruitment. So in terms of social media, people always ask, well, what's the number one app for that? I will not answer that, because what we have found is that every app, as long as you have people on it, predators and traffickers will go on it too. So thinking about in your own personal lives, if you have kids, if they're on apps, be very careful with what apps you allow them to have, and be very mindful of what features each app has that they are utilizing. So we know that traffickers are on all the apps that I have listed on the screen, plus many, many more. They also love to utilize private texting platforms like Kik or WhatsApp. This is something that a lot of parents don't know to monitor. They often don't even know that their kid has private texting apps on their phone because it looks like the regular texting app that comes on their phone from the factory. And it can, in certain cases, be more difficult for law enforcement to trace. So be very mindful of that. And then finally, dating apps. Believe it or not, kids who are not legally allowed to be on these apps are on these apps. You have kids being solicited on Grindr, Tinder, Meet Me, Plenty of Fish. So just be very mindful that all of that is occurring. And we do unfortunately have a lot of youth, especially who are utilizing these apps, even though they're not supposed to be. So the recruitment process, as I mentioned, is typically based on fraud. And another way to look at it is by calling it grooming. So I'm going to go through right now the stages of grooming to kind of illustrate to you how this relationship technically unfolds. Do keep in mind that I talk a lot about how this could be long-term, but do know that sometimes grooming and recruitment can happen in a very short span of time as well. So you can have folks who were recruited and turned out for sex trafficking within 12 hours. We have actually seen those cases in our state. 12 hours from first contact with the trafficker before they're being sex trafficked. It can be that fast, but there is always, all of this occurs on a spectrum. So just keep that in mind. So the first stage of grooming and recruitment is going to be targeting that victim. They're going to look for folks who are vulnerable, and people who they think they can most easily exploit. Once they've done that, they're going to form a bond. It's much more easy to take advantage of somebody if you can get them to trust you or to be in love with you. Think about this. You are in a relationship with somebody, you've been dating them for a year. You love them, they've always treated you well. How much whiplash would you have if, one day they decided that they wanted to start sexually exploiting you? You would be very confused. You would be questioning everything, that had already transpired in this relationship. And it would be, really, really disarming and disconcerting, of course. So you have traffickers who are taking advantage of this bond and this relationship that they built. Not only that, but thinking about familial trafficking, which we've seen a huge rise in, especially since the pandemic. Okay. You have family members exploiting and trafficking other members of their family. That person who's trafficking that victim, that might be their only family or their most safe person in their life. Okay. So, and that trafficker is taking advantage of the trust and bond that that victim has in them, and they're using it to their advantage. They're then going to look to fill a need. So every person has a need at one point or another. So I have some little icons here. So talking about basic needs like a place to stay, a hot meal, clothes, but also think about the more commonplace. So you have a teenager who they got broken up with by their boyfriend today. And now this trafficker, they post about it on social media, and then somebody's now reached out and they're giving them attention. There's maybe an older male, older female who's really like trying to, give them a lot of compliments, make them feel better, and that attention, when you're in that vulnerable state of going through a breakup as a teenager, that can be very compelling. So think about those things too. When we have, more severe things going on, like, maybe home isn't safe. So that potential trafficker is offering them a safe place to stay. Or maybe mom and dad are arguing a lot right now and they just need somebody to vent and to talk to. That trafficker might be that shoulder to cry on for a time. So whatever that need happens to be, they're going to take advantage of it. And then they're going to work on access and separation. So this can occur in the literal sense, right? Where they're going to try to lure that person away from home, into, where they're staying or to go with them. But it can also occur in, a more nuanced way where they're basically trying to act as a replacement for the existing social connections that that victim had. So you know, I'm your family now. Your family doesn't understand you. They don't care about you. I don't really think you should be hanging out with those friends anymore. Why don't you spend more time with me? There are ways to kind of build up walls around that victim, without having to physically do so. It really kind of puts pressure on them to really only dialogue with that trafficker and to kind of diminish their connection to other people. And that's when the exploitation and abuse is going to begin. Okay. And at this point, the goal of that trafficker is to, number one, make money by exploiting that person. And in order to do that, they're going to have to maintain control. Okay. So that means, in the sense of a lot of coercion. So, like I had mentioned, threatening that person, using blackmail and sextortion, relying on that fraud and deception of, the importance of that relationship. And then, of course, it also can mean physical and sexual and psychological violence. So this is the human trafficking power and control wheel. So if anybody has ever worked in the anti-violence field or with intimate partner violence, domestic violence, you may be familiar with this. This is adapted from the domestic violence power and control wheel. And what this demonstrates is all the different ways that somebody can maintain power and control over another person. And this is really key to understanding sex trafficking scenarios. So one of the things I like to always mention on here is the denying, blaming, and minimizing. So they're going to try to make that victim believe that everything that has happened to them is their fault, that this is, their own doing 100%, and that they are in no way a victim of a crime. This is helpful because it really limits that victim's insight into their status as an actual victim of a crime. So they're less likely to come forward. When it comes to youth, they're going to normalize the adult sex industry. So they're going to make them think, oh, this is just what adults do. They'll say things like, if you were mature, you would understand. If you were, actually grown up, you'd be able to handle this. And for those of us who have teenagers at home or can remember being a teenager, the number one thing a teen wants is to be an adult and to feel that autonomy. And so that can be a very compelling argument for that person. They think, I am an adult. I am mature. I can make my own decisions. And if this is what adults do, then I can do it too. They're going to, again, make that person feel guilt and blame for the situation. They're going to convince that person that they are not a person but property and that nobody cares about them. They're going to rely on a lot of economic abuse because a lot of people in trafficking situations and prostitution do not have a lot of great financial resources to begin with. And so they're going to try to take all the money. They're going to take all or most of the money that's earned from that victim. They're going to prohibit access to finances, and they're going to kind of do like a carrot stick situation where they might give a little bit of an allowance, or they might buy that person like a nice purse or something, just to kind of keep them pacified. But in reality, they're not earning any of that money. That trafficker is keeping all or most of that money. So I'm going to kind of leave this here. If anybody wants more information on this, well, I'm happy to send a copy to you so you can kind of dive into a lot of these points a little bit deeper. So these are some myths that we hear a lot about trafficking crimes. And I'm going to kind of list these. And then in the next slide, I will go over what is the actual reality. So myth number one is that trafficking victims are most often kidnapped from public places like store parking lots. I don't know about you, but anytime I go on social media, I feel like I hear another story about how Target parking lots are like the #1 hunting ground for predators. We know that that is not accurate. Okay, so there's no #1 hotspot. If anybody tries to tell you that, this mall or this store or this location is the #1 recruitment hotspot, it's likely to be false. Most victims are, people will often say that most victims of trafficking are undocumented foreign nationals. That's also a myth. Okay. We have another myth. People engaging in prostitution keep all or most of the money they earn. Traffickers like to target victims that they don't know. And then finally, only women and girls can be victims or survivors of trafficking. And now let's get into the reality. Trafficking victims are typically recruited through grooming, as I mentioned, often by someone they know, like a romantic partner or a family member. While anyone can be a victim, most victims in the United States were born here and raised here. Okay, we do have foreign victims, but that is not the majority by any means. They're people with and from our communities. Traffickers keep most or all of the money that a victim earns, and they maintain strict control over how money is spent. Trafficking victims are also typically recruited through grooming, often by someone they know, as I reiterated before. And finally, people of all genders can and have been trafficked: boys, girls, men, women. So it's really important to understand the connection between prostitution and sex trafficking crimes. So the way to look at this, at least what's helpful for me, is prostitution. What sets prostitution apart from sex trafficking is the evidence of force, fraud, and coercion. Okay. It is highly likely that most people in prostitution are actually victims of sex trafficking. We just haven't found the evidence of those elements yet. So prostitution, just by and large, is a practice of gender-based violence. And another way to look at it is non-consensual sex that occurs alongside the exchange of goods or money. And we're going to kind of dive into this a little bit. Gender-based violence is a harm or threats to harm committed against a person based on their actual or perceived sex, gender, sexual orientation, or their identity or expression. Okay. And we know this because most people in prostitution and sex trafficking are women and girls. Men and boys can also be prostituted and sex trafficked. However, the vast majority are targeted because they identify as LGBTQIA, which fits into that definition of gender-based violence. The foundation of the commercial sex industry is the subordination of women and gender and sexual minorities for the sexual gratification of others. And we also know that women, girls, and gender sexual minorities are dehumanized, objectified, and treated like property or a commodity rather than as people. And to that point, sexual violence is the primary mechanism utilized to maintain power and control over prostituted people. And finally, research has shown that sex buyers are most often men, middle or upper class, and college educated. This group has a very, specific status and position in society, and they're able to use financial resources that people in prostitution and sex trafficking do not have to purchase the use of another person's body for their own sexual gratification. And we know this because the use of prostituted people and sex trafficking victims is truly the commodification of power and control. So, kind of taking another 5,000-foot view on the issue, in terms of sex trafficking, the average age a person or a child is first introduced into sex trafficking in Arizona is 14 years old. Prostituted women have a 200% greater chance of dying prematurely than a non-prostituted woman. Approximately 90% of prostituted people claim they want to escape the profession, but have no other options. And approximately 70% of prostituted people report being raped and 60% report PTSD symptoms. Those are self-disclosures, so the actual figures are reliably much higher. Approximately 75% of people in prostitution report experiencing homelessness at one point. And in 2021, 1 in 6 runaways reported to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children were suspected victims of human trafficking. Approximately 79% of trafficked individuals enter the commercial sex trade as children. So when you try to make a distinction between an adult in prostitution today who was a sex trafficking victim a year ago, we really as a society have to kind of think that through, right? We have most of our adults who are now in prostitution were child sex trafficking victims. And finally, of the children reported to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in 2021 who would run from the care of child welfare, 19% were likely victims of child sex trafficking. There has been a demonstrated correlation between kids who are in child welfare and foster care being one of the most highly targeted groups for sex trafficking. So when you look at all of this together, you have most of them starting off as children, most of them experiencing homelessness, most of them being subjected to sexual assault and post-traumatic stress disorder, okay? Most of them wanting to get out, but having no other way to. To me, that does not equal consent. And that's why we say that prostitution on its own is a practice of gender-based violence. You may have heard someone say, and I list these because I've personally heard all of them. Prostitution is a victimless crime. It's a world-old profession. Sex buyers are helping prostitute people earn a decent living. Individuals in prostitution are there by choice and wouldn't be there if they didn't want to be. All of these statements stand in contrast to all of the data and the scholarship on this issue. But not only that, these statements stand in direct contrast to the lived experiences of people in prostitution and sex trafficking victims. So in the next remaining slides, I'm going to look at who our victims are and things that you guys can look for and how to make that report. So these are a list of victim profile risk factors. So if you have folks who have a substance use issue, past history of trauma, child welfare involvement or history running away, identifying as LGBTQIA, that's on there because oftentimes kids are either kicked out of their homes for their sexual identity or they're kind of forced to leave because home is no longer safe. And so that can put them at a higher risk. Family instability, this could be the severe, but it could also be mom and dad are just fighting a lot and they don't have 100% laser focus on that child, and that child is maybe, upset about the discord that's happening at home. Poverty and economics, kids are, they may see mom or dad struggling to make ends meet, and the trafficker is going to come in and offer them that, employment opportunity that turns out to be something very different. Gang involvement, and then finally, history of abuse. As I mentioned, everybody at some time or another has a vulnerability. It doesn't matter who you are. They're going to look for people who lack strong support networks, have unstable home lives, or a prior trauma. And even those common issues we talked about, like self-esteem, mental health, and a growing desire for independence. As I have kind of alluded to, we have a lot of different, like in terms of traffickers, there's different scenarios. So you've got pimp controlled trafficking where you have the 3 parties, right? You've got trafficker, sex buyer, victim. Familial trafficking, where the trafficking is actually being conducted by a relative or a person perceived by the child to be a family member, like an auntie or uncle. You've got gang controlled trafficking. And they, unfortunately, because of their structure, they can very easily kind of organize a more orchestrated trafficking scenario. And then finally, buyer perpetrated trafficking. So in this scenario, you only have the buyer and the child. You could also call that buyer a predator. That's what they are. So this is when a child is trafficked but does not have an identified trafficker. The buyer directly being exploited by that sex buyer, often in exchange for basic needs like money, food, and shelter. The mindset of a victim is key. Please understand that because of everything we've talked about today, trafficking victims rarely self-identify as victims, and they do not know that what has happened to them is actually a criminal act. The other piece of this too is traffickers are smart, and they know that if they can get that victim to commit criminal acts outside of their prostitution and sex trafficking victimization, they can use that as leverage so that victim will not come forward. So they will say, you need to run these drugs, you need to rob this sex buyer. And if you ever try to come forward and report what has happened to you, I will tell the prosecutor and law enforcement all of these other crimes that you've been committing. So if you turn me in, you're going down too. They're going to distrust people in positions of authority, including law enforcement. They are trying to survive today to make it to tomorrow. And they likely have what's called a trauma bond with their trafficker, which basically means, I'm not going to get into all the psychology of it, but they will possibly protect that person against their best interest. Okay. They fear that their loved ones are going to be harmed. So again, they may protect that trafficker to keep their family safe. And these factors are going to pose a significant barrier to somebody disclosing their status as a victim. We're getting into the warning signs now. I do want to always give this caveat that some of these things I'm going to list are lawful. If you see one thing on here, it does not necessarily mean that person is a victim of sex trafficking. What you want to look for is multiple indicators. And I always recommend having another set of eyes on it. So if this is happening in the context of your professional life, bring in a colleague, bring in a couple colleagues, have them observe what you're observing. Okay. I think there's always great strength in numbers, and your colleague may see something that you didn't see. So things to look for. A presence of an overly controlling and abusive boyfriend, girlfriend, or family member, romantic partner. Really good time to tell you that traffickers are not just men. We have female traffickers too. So keep that in mind. If somebody is going to avert their eyes or not make eye contact, again, think of this in context. You want to see more than just somebody averting their eyes to consider that a possible trafficking victim. If they have a lack of knowledge about their current or past whereabouts, or have a lost sense of time. If you ask them, oh, how long have you lived in the area? Oh, you're just visiting. How long are you staying for? Oh, where are you from? Where are you going next? Those types of things are very easy questions that most people should be able to answer. If they have inconsistencies in their story, if it just doesn't make sense to you, if they seem to kind of go back on things or change their story a bunch, if they don't have access to their own ID, cell phone, money, or other personal belongings. If you feel like they are showing signs of disassociation or avoiding interaction. So disassociation can kind of look like, if you're talking to that person, it's almost like you're looking through them, right? It's like they're there, but they're not there. Okay. They're just not really present with what is currently happening around them. You could see signs of poor hygiene, being fatigue, sleep deprivation, lack of medical care. If they have few or no personal possessions, if they have any, they might be carried in small plastic bags or even reusable bags. If their demeanor seems to be fearful, anxious, depressed, submissive, and if they're dressed inappropriately for their age or have a lower quality of clothing than companions. So thinking about this in context right now, up where you guys are at, if somebody is not wearing a whole lot of clothes and they're, outside, or, they just seem like they don't have enough on to keep warm, that would be a red flag to me. If they're wearing suggestive clothing, I think that's a little bit more cut and dry, right? But they're not always going to wear suggestive clothing. They may just have a very low quality of clothing. They may have dirty clothes. They may not have enough on to keep warm. Down here in the valley where I'm from, we also look out for people who are wearing long sleeves and long pants, in an odd context, especially in the middle of the summer. You have victims who might be wearing long sleeves and things like that to conceal injuries. I mean, if it's super hot outside, that's obviously not desirable, right? So just think about clothing, especially in context of the environment and the surrounding. So other things to think about, you have signs of addiction or sexual trauma or self-harm. Other injuries on the body, especially in various stages of healing. Think injuries where you don't normally get injuries, right? Like you might stub your toe or bang your knee on the coffee table, but you most often are not going to have a scratch across your face, abrasions, bruises on your arms, things like that. Branding tattoos. So traffickers love to send the message that their victims are property, not people. One of the best ways to do that, put your name on them. Put your name or your nickname on that person. So they do that to show ownership, right? They also utilize mottos like trust and loyalty, money signs, guns, crowns, diamonds, things that signify wealth. And then do keep in mind if you have individuals with the same or similar tattoo or tattoos on the hands, face, neck. If you have somebody who has their Cash App or Venmo tattooed on them in any place, that's always a red flag as well. When it comes to minors, you want to look for kids who are chronically homeless or running away or have been kicked out. If they seem to like they're lying about their age or they're using a fake ID, if they're truant or repeatedly absent from school, they have a sudden change in attire. So that child might all of a sudden have brand new purse, really nice designer clothes, brand new shoes, expensive jewelry, even a brand new cell phone or electronics. That trafficker, again, is trying to, give them the things that they may like, things that will get them on their side. If that child expresses concern for the safety of their family, or if they're using sex trafficking terminology, which could include but is not limited to blade, track, trick, in call, out call. So what to do in terms of reporting? I always recommend going through your chain of command if this happens within a professional setting. But by and large, the best thing you can do to get them best response is to call 911, especially if that possible victim is a minor. I know that that's not always ideal, but that is always the best recommendation. And I highly recommend not intervening in any way, because your safety is also paramount in that situation. So it's best to let law enforcement kind of take the lead on those scenarios. We also have some other hotlines, though. If you don't feel comfortable calling 911, you have the Arizona Child Abuse Hotline here, and we've got the National Human Trafficking Hotline as well. Keep in mind that the response time, if you submit a tip through the national hotline, is several days. So if you have somebody in front of you who you think might need help pretty soon, I wouldn't recommend the hotline. If it's a longer term deal where no one's in immediate danger, I might recommend the hotline. It's available 24/7 in over 200 languages, and they have 3 different ways that you can submit the tip anonymously. We are also excited to share that we have a brand new Arizona specific tip line. This just launched in January, and the number is there on the bottom. There's also a warm line component to that, which means that if you have a victim who's calling, who's needing help, it's run by DPS, Department of Public Safety, but if you have a victim who doesn't necessarily want to submit a tip, but they want to ask for help from, either a survivor or a social worker, they can request that by still calling that Arizona tip line number. These are some other resources. If you want to learn more, these are, the big ones that I would recommend. And sextraffickinghelp.com is a great resource too. They have resources for victims that are broken up by county. And with that, I'm going to share my information here. I am always happy to be a resource to you. I am so glad and thrilled that you guys took this training today. And I truly hope that if there's an interest that we can continue doing more of this training with your county. And with that, I would just love to see if we have any questions.
There's one in the chat. Did the numbers apply to tribal nations or do they have their own hotline?
The numbers do apply. Yes.
Great.
And I'm not aware of any, there's some hotlines, but I have not found a trafficking specific hotline for tribal communities.
Okay. And then someone mentioned in the chat, some places are also isolated businesses / company owned properties. I think that was when we were talking about like the areas for trafficking to happen, probably.
Yeah, I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I don't think
It was just a statement. Some places are also isolated businesses / like company owned properties.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, if that's ever the case and you feel like there might be activity, like that's why I always recommend just even like the non-emergency line, getting law enforcement out there just to kind of see what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. Thank you so much for being here today. And if there are any more questions, everyone feel free to speak up or put it in the chat really quick. But we are at 1:01, so I don't want to take too much of everybody's time. But again, thank you, Michelle, for being here today. I learned a lot more than I thought about this particular issue, and I just appreciate you giving us your time and presentation, because now I'm thinking about, places that I've been that I've like, oh, that could have been a place, that could have been a person, that could have been a thing. But thank you. And we're getting some thank yous in the chat. I think people are heading out, but
yeah, no, it's absolutely my pleasure. I really truly appreciate everybody's time and attention. And it doesn't really matter what, if you have a church group, anything like that, any type of group that you're personally even affiliated with, our organization does a lot of tailored trainings for pretty much any group at no cost. So please feel free to reach out if you have anyone else that you think would like this information as well.
Okay, great. That's good to know. Well, it was good to see everybody, and I think I'm gonna close the meeting now because I'm not seeing much in the chat going on. But again, thanks for being here, Michelle, and also shout out to Corey Ringenberg for being the contact to get you here. That's great.
Oh yes, thank you so much, Corey. Couldn't have done this without you.
He's on.
He's the best.
He's great. He's honorary HR. He's thumbing up, so that's good. Well,
Right.
hopefully we'll see you again, Michelle, and thank you everyone for joining, and have a great rest of the day.
You as well. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.